So, I did have plans to do a video I was teasing a few months ago, but that's been pushed back to next week simply because there were two news stories from the world of Formula 1 that couldn't be ignored, especially one that broke after I finished editing my Formula E video a couple of weeks ago. So we're going to do this video similarly to how we did the Hamilton Ferrari and Andretti rejection video, as well as the Ocon Alpine departure and MotoGP silly season video, in that we will combine the two news stories into one video. So let's start off with the one that broke 2 weeks ago, Daniel Ricciardo's immediate departure from VCARB. So for people who are somehow unaware, it was announced a few days after the Singapore Grand Prix that Daniel Ricciardo had been released from VCARB with immediate effect and would be replaced for the final 6 races by the same man that replaced Daniel when he broke his hand last year, Liam Lawson. Now it's safe to say that this news didn't come as a surprise, as in the week building up to the Singapore Grand Prix, rumours were floating around that Ricciardo was entering his final race due to the fact that it was reported that a review on Daniel's status would be taken towards the end of September, given the clause that Liam Lawson had on his contract, which stated that if his future within the Red Bull family wasn't secure by that time, he was free to join another team, which in this case was Sauber, in time for Audi's takeover in 2026. And this speculation was added further when Ricciardo himself, during some pre-weekend interviews, whilst not confirming it was his last race, didn't deny that it was either. And after he was seen sitting in his car for a while in Parc Fermé after the race had concluded, combined with him also giving an emotional interview on F1 TV after the race, it reaffirmed the fact that this was more than likely his final race. And so, fast forward 4 days later, and these rumours became a reality, when VCARB announced that Ricciardo would be departing from the team with immediate effect and would be replaced by Lawson for the remainder of the season. Now it's safe to say that the way that both Red Bull and VCARB handled the situation was very poor, as the vibe Ricciardo was given throughout that weekend made the whole situation very awkward, especially on Sunday, which was when Ricciardo was told the news that this would be his last race. And judging from his emotions after the race, one would assume that Ricciardo was told the news before the race rather than afterwards. But although Ricciardo probably didn't get the send-off that he deserved, given some of the things he has achieved in F1, as well as being one of the most popular drivers on the F1 grid, did he deserve to get the chop? Personally, I believe so. Despite what he achieved during his career, it's safe to say that Ricciardo has not been the same driver he used to be back when he was driving for Red Bull. Ever since leaving Red Bull at the end of 2018, it felt like there was something missing within Ricciardo's driving, as the man who was known for his late braking manoeuvres and being able to make an aggressive strategy work wasn't able to transfer that form into the teams he drove for afterwards. Now granted, when he joined Renault in 2019, although it got off to a shaky start, things were starting to improve for Daniel, even if the team were holding him back at times. And when the 2020 season came around, things looked like they were starting to click, and with Ricciardo essentially being the team leader, it looked like the project could be going places. However, by the time things started to click, Ricciardo had already decided literally before the season began that his future was no longer with Renault, which would become Alpine in 2021, and would instead be with McLaren, who had a seat vacant after Carlos Sainz decided to depart the team to replace the Aston Martin-bound Sebastian Vettel at Ferrari, which eventually led to Sergio Perez booting Alex Albon out of the second Red Bull seat, putting Alex on the sidelines for 2021. Now it's fair to say at the time that there was a lot of hype surrounding Daniel's move to McLaren, as the team looked to finally be on the up after a bit of a barren spell, with the team reuniting with Mercedes from 2021 after essentially being on a 3-year stopgap with Renault following the messy divorce with Honda at the end of 2017. Many people, including myself, expected Daniel to essentially become the team leader and for him to beat his teammate Lando Norris, who was entering his 3rd year in F1. However, this turned out not to be the case, as Lando would end up having a breakout year, with him essentially running circles around Daniel throughout the year. Apart from the Italian Grand Prix, where Daniel would grab what would turn out to be his final win in F1, leading Lando home to the only 1-2 finish scene in 2021, Ricciardo for whatever reason just couldn't get to grips with the McLaren, with Monaco being the most notable, where he would end up being lapped by his own teammate. The lack of pace Daniel was showing would lead to McLaren losing third in the Constructors to Ferrari, with Ricciardo finishing 8th in the Drivers, 45 points behind his teammate Lando, who finished a point ahead of Charles Leclerc in 6th. Ricciardo would remain with McLaren for 2022 when the new regulations were implemented into the sport, but knew he needed to step up his game even if he did have a year left on his contract. And although the start of the season saw Daniel on par with Lando, by the time the car had turned a corner in its performance after what was a difficult start to the season for the team, Daniel's pace would once again drop off and he would once again be outpaced by his younger teammate. This led to speculation that Ricciardo could be dropped, with the likes of IndyCar sensation Alex Palou being rumoured to move over to F1 with the Woking-based team. But Daniel made it clear that he wasn't going anywhere and reminded people that he still had a year left on his contract. Then came the Oscar Piastri contract saga, where after Alpine initially announced that Piastri would be replacing Alonso for 2023, Oscar would go onto Twitter to refute this, stating that he would not be driving for Alpine in 2023, leading to rumours that he was joining McLaren instead, booting out his fellow compatriot Ricciardo. And these rumours would end up being true, when in the week building up to the Belgian Grand Prix, it was announced that Ricciardo would be leaving McLaren at the end of 2022, effectively having his contract terminated a year before it was meant to run out. And despite having offers from the likes of Haas, Ricciardo chose to turn those offers down, deciding to take a year out and reunite with Red Bull to become their official reserve driver. Although Ricciardo admitted that he did enjoy his time away from the sport, he knew deep down that he wanted to be back on the grid and was just waiting for an opportunity to present itself. And that moment would arrive when Nick de Vries, who was brought in to replace the Alpine-bound Pierre Gasly, was dropped by AlphaTauri after only 10 races, allowing Ricciardo, who was doing a test with Red Bull at Silverstone, to step in for the remainder of the season. Despite having to miss 5 races due to breaking his hand during practice for the Dutch Grand Prix, Ricciardo had a decent return, with him being on pace with Tsunoda and even at times outpacing him, with people expecting him to beat Tsunoda in 2024, with the aim of him potentially replacing Sergio Perez at Red Bull in 2025. However, this wouldn't happen, as although there were some bright sparks during the season, even to the point where there were talks of Ricciardo booting Perez out mid-season, Ricciardo overall was outpaced heavily by Tsunoda, and with the September deadline approaching on Lawson's contract, it was only a matter of time before Ricciardo was shown the door out of VCARB and potentially out of F1 as well. Now, whilst Ricciardo's exit from the sport wasn't ideal, you can't argue that his dismissal wasn't deserved, especially with everything I've mentioned, and the fact that Liam Lawson has been getting a lot of hate, mainly from Ricciardo fans, is really disappointing to see, as Liam has done nothing wrong to justify that. The fact is, if Ricciardo wanted to save his career and get back to the main Red Bull team, he should have stepped up his game, and quite frankly, he hasn't. That being said though, it is going to be sad not seeing Daniel on the grid, and I do wish him all the very best in whatever he does next. In terms of Liam Lawson, we already saw what he was capable of in the 5 races he did last year, and I am curious to see if he can continue that form into the final 6 races of this year. What will be curious though is what will happen to him in 2025, as it is very obvious he will be on the grid next year with the Red Bull family. It's just a question of which Red Bull team he will be with. It's interesting to note that VCARB have only announced Liam to be racing with them in the final 6 races, and not also into 2025, and this has led to speculation that Red Bull are using these 6 races as a way to assess Liam as a potential replacement for Checo at Red Bull, as although Sergio has a contract with Red Bull until 2026, his poor performances throughout this year and also last year have led to speculation that Red Bull are regretting giving him that extension. If Liam doesn't impress in these final 6 races, then I expect Checo to keep his drive for at least next year. But if Liam does impress, then Checo may need to watch his back. Now let's move on to the next bit of F1 news, which involves Renault's withdrawal from F1. So 4 days after the Ricciardo news came out, it was announced that French manufacturer Renault would be ending its engine program at the end of 2025, with Alpine, the team that they were supplying the engines to, partnering with a customer engine from 2026. The news, it's fair to say, like with the Ricciardo news, didn't come as a surprise, as it had been rumoured for months, and it felt like a question of when the news would break, rather than if the news would break, even with the protest Renault employees made a few days before the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. Renault have enjoyed a lot of success in F1 over various eras of the sport, with their latest success coming in the back end of the V8 era, where in partnership with Red Bull, they would win 4 Constructors' Crowns and 4 Drivers' Crowns with Sebastian Vettel. But the start of the 2014 season would see the start of Renault's downfall, as that year would see the introduction of the 1.6 litre V6 turbocharged hybrids, and not 2.4 litres that I mistakenly said during my video about Formula 2's current issue. During that year, it was very clear that Renault had not took to these regulations very well, with them being way behind Mercedes, who had gotten the regulations spot on, and also suffering from numerous amounts of reliability issues, which saw Red Bull lose out on a number of points. This was made worse in 2015, where even though they were able to sort out the reliability issues from 2014, the engine was down on power, which saw them not only fall further behind Mercedes, but also fall behind Ferrari, who after a difficult 2014 season were able to turn a corner in their engine performance. The Renault engine's lack of speed was so bad that it even led to Red Bull exploring their options for 2016, with them looking to seek a customer deal with either Mercedes or Ferrari, but in the end were forced to stick with Renault, with Mercedes rejecting any offers made by them, and Ferrari only willing to offer a 2015 spec engine, which ended up going to Red Bull's sister team Toro Rosso. They did briefly talk with Honda about a potential deal, but with them having a difficult return to the sport with McLaren, it ended up not being a viable option at the time. So they ended up staying with Renault, but because of their fractured relationship, Red Bull were forced to rebadge their engines as Tag Heuer, whilst the Renault name would end up at Enstone again after the French manufacturer purchased the Lotus team from Jenny Capital. Whilst the Renault team would end up having a tricky season, mainly in large due to the Renault engine being a tight squeeze at the back of the car, given the chassis was intended to have a Mercedes engine, the Red Bull team would have a much better season, but in the speed traps, they were still down on power compared to Mercedes and Ferrari, even with the tricky season the prancing horse would end up having. Then, in 2017 and 2018, whilst the Renault team wouldn't suffer from too many issues, along with Toro Rosso who reunited with them in 2017, rebadging them as Toro Rosso, Red Bull on the other hand wouldn't be so fortunate, as along with them still being down on power compared to Mercedes and Ferrari, they would once again, like in 2014, suffer from a huge amount of mechanical issues, which even led to the drivers getting annoyed with the power unit. By the time the 2018 season was a few races in, Red Bull had had enough, and thanks to their sister team Toro Rosso switching to Honda engines that same year, which led to McLaren acquiring the Renault power units instead, Red Bull were able to get out of their deal with Renault and switch to Honda engines from 2019, where it's fair to say that the partnership has served them well. On the topic of Honda, it was during 2018, specifically towards the back end of the season, that they had overtaken Renault in performance and were now in a position where they could challenge both Mercedes and Ferrari. Whilst McLaren were able to fare much better with the Renault engine throughout 2019 and 2020, the Renault team on the other hand were not so fortunate, as 2019 would see the team suffer from mechanical issues that Red Bull experienced the previous 2 years, with the 2019 Bahrain Grand Prix being the most notable, where both Hülkenberg and Ricciardo would break down at exactly the same time at exactly the same corner. 2020 looked like the team were finally able to get a grasp of the engine regs. However, the French manufacturer were hit with another blow when customers McLaren announced back in 2019 that they would be reuniting with Mercedes from 2021, leaving the Enstone-based team, which would become Alpine in 2021, as the only team to be supplied by the French manufacturer. And this would end up hampering the team going forward, as although the team would have a decent 2021 and 2022 season, with 2021 seeing the team grab their first win since 2012, by the time the 2023 season arrived, the team had slipped behind Aston Martin, who had taken a big leap forward in the pecking order, and once the Austrian Grand Prix had arrived, they had also slipped behind McLaren, who were starting to become a front-running team again. Then, in 2024, the team would slip back even further, with the team at the beginning of the season having the worst car on the grid, with Ocon and Gasly qualifying on the back row of the grid in Bahrain. The team's performance would improve as the season went on, but it was still not ideal. And at the time of recording, the team currently sit 9th in the Constructors, with Williams recently overtaking them for 8th thanks to improvements they made to their car, as well as the team dropping Logan Sargent for Franco Colapinto, who has been very impressive since his debut at Monza, to the point where he has become a late contender for the second Sauber seat next year. Their drop in performance led to speculation that the French manufacturer were considering pulling the plug on their engine program, essentially throwing in the towel despite being signed up for the new engine regs in 2026. And so, on the 30th of September 2024, it was announced that Renault were to pull out of the sport at the end of 2025 and not the end of this year as originally thought, reducing the number of manufacturers signed up for 2026 from 6 to 5. Despite this though, it was also announced that their team Alpine would continue to race in the sport, but would be powered by a customer engine from an existing manufacturer, which, if the rumours are to be believed, is more than likely going to be Mercedes. Now, in terms of my thoughts on this, whilst I can't say I'm not surprised, it's still sad nonetheless. To see any manufacturer drop out of the sport is a massive blow, but to see a manufacturer pull out before the new engine regs have come into fruition is a massive kick in the teeth for F1, especially given that Renault had initially signed up to these new regs in the first place. Bet they are now regretting not letting Andretti in, as they would have gained another manufacturer in Cadillac. With Alpine continuing in the sport without Renault, there have been suggestions that the team would sell up at some point in the future. However, although I do see where they are coming from, at the same time, I can't see who would even purchase them, especially now that we live in a time where purchasing an existing team is considered just as expensive as entering your own team in the sport, even for a manufacturer like GM, Toyota or Hyundai. The only sort of companies who would probably be interested in paying that amount to purchase a team would be a private equity firm like the Saudi-owned PIF company, and let's be honest here, that would not be a good look for F1 if that were to happen. But we will wait and see what happens. Whilst I'm sad that we've lost an engine manufacturer, I am curious to see if Alpine are able to progress now that they don't need to worry about building their own engines. But whether they will have the budget to do that now that they will be losing their manufacturer status remains to be seen. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and let me know your thoughts on Ricciardo being dropped for Lawson. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next week for the next video.